Welcome back to another insightful discussion here on the Champions Path, a platform for all things simulation and training, designed for our champions in the military, law enforcement, and other first responder roles. I'm here with Ken Murray, a master instructor and founder of the Reality Based Training Association, co-founder of Simunition, and of course, author of the world-renowned book, Training at the Speed of Life. And this book has been used by agencies around the world for building safe and effective scenario-based training exercises. Ken, you're an incredibly accomplished man, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit down and have this reality-based training discussion with me today.
Well, I'm honored to be here, Jared. As you know, we've been trying to get this thing going for a little while, and between travel and other obligations on both sides, I'm glad that that day's finally here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before we begin, Ken, if you don't mind, maybe give us a brief highlight of your career and some of your accomplishments.
Ooh, brief highlight. It started over a game of paintball back in the early to mid 1980s, and that led me on a journey of curiosity. I thought this was very, very interesting. I'd like to do more of this. It was fun. And I started looking for where I might get the equipment to do that. And long story, very, very short, is that I met the guy that was making the guns in Canada. And he and I became friends and started looking at the potential for utilizing paintballs in a more institutional way. The guy that had done all of the plastic molding and working on Dave's gun was quite a gun enthusiast on his own right. Interesting in Canada, because Canada is not exactly renowned for innovation when it comes to guns. It's kind of an anti-gun place. But in the time, Ted Szabo, who certainly is renowned for the high-capacity 45 with the Parrott ordnance gun, was the first guy to really break the round barrier on 45 pistols and launched an entire industry of that. But David and I got the institutional rights for a little paintball gun that was the first of its kind, primer-powered paint gun that utilized a cartridge-based technology. It was about 1.5 inches long and fired a 40 caliber paintball in something that looked like a Mac 10, a little Ingram Mac 11, actually, the 9mm version. And Szabo had figured out how to make a gun fire paintballs without blowing them up. And so it had no real utility in the paintball space because the projectiles were far too fast and far too dangerous for the conventional paintball space. And so there was a commercial failure on that front. But David and I had the institutional rights to it, and I just started looking around for places that it might go. I was down in Norfolk, Virginia, and I walked there was a Marine side of the house there. Found a guy by the name of Dan Jasinski. And Dan was with the 5th Counterintelligence Team down there, and he saw what I was peddling, and he thought, that's really, really interesting. We have no use for it whatsoever, but I know a guy. And he walked me in the back door of a nondescript building and up to the cubicle of a guy. I was at Dev Group at the time. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where I'd been brought. But he had a cartoon up on his cubicle. So there's a knight standing at the door of the king's armory. And he's saying, "Sire, there's a weapons salesman here to see you." And the king doesn't even turn around as he sifts through a mountain of shattered shields and broken swords and chipped helmets. He says, "Tell him to F off. Can't you see I'm getting ready for war?" And underneath, he'd written, "Never be too busy to see the next cool thing." So he said to me, "Show me the next cool thing." And I showed him this little Mac 11. It was called the M85. I showed him this little machine gun that fired paintballs, and he said, "That is kind of cool. We've been investigating projectile-based training, and we've looked at paintball, but there's nothing that's really compelling in the firearms training space, especially since they're not cartridge-based technology. But we don't use Mac 11s. And I said, well, no, but you don't understand. This is for tactical training. It's not for precision marksmanship. And he chuckled at me. He said, yeah, you've got some learning to do. And I didn't understand at the time that functional fidelity was an extremely important thing, that over the next decades, I realized that we need functional fidelity, which also leads into some of the augmented reality space, needing to have functional fidelity in some of the weapon systems in the VR AR space. And so he asked if we could make that cartridge fit something like an MP5 or an M16 or a SIG pistol they were using at the time. I said, I didn't know. And so we went back to Szabo and said, hey, here's what we want to do. Is it technologically feasible? He said, well, kind of. He said the cartridge itself can be downsized, but there's no projectile in commercial existence that we'd be able to use. You need to figure out a projectile. And so we launched onto the development path of trying to create a ballistically stable paintball, essentially. And the projectile that's currently being used today in the FX marking cartridge system is the projectile that we designed, and we're able to get it ballistically stable. And that's what was going to be used in this new training device. And we got a contract from Dev Group for, I think it was about 600 of each, 600 MP5, 600 M16s, 600 SIG pistols, and time, since it was a developmental item. And we were pretty excited about that. We spoke with the Canadian Defence Programs Bureau, which was a big government program for trying to raise the awareness of the world marketplace to Canadian defense industries. And so we got some grant funding from them. We tried to put together, or did put together, a limited partnership for basic funding. We had Dymaco, the manufacturer of the M16 in Canada, the C7, the C8 firearms. They were going to produce the conversion devices and the weapons. And SNC, that was the big ammo producer in Canada, they were going to produce the ammo. And everything was going to be great. And a year goes by and we haven't seen anything from Szabo. So he said, what's going on, buddy? He said, well, I've been waiting around to see how this is going to go. And apparently it's going to be like a really, really good commercial opportunity. Therefore, new deal. I want $1 million in cash. I want 51% of the company that's going to use to promote this stuff. I want a 15-cent royalty on every round sold, yada, yada. And we were dead in the water. It was just done. And so there we were with a big idea and a big initial contract with no capacity to fulfill either of these things. And so we went back to the drawing board and brought a bunch of brain trust people together and came up with that telescoping cartridge design that's used not only in the FX cartridge, but UTM uses the same thing. ATK, when they took my buddy Rick Huffman's design for a cartridge and kind of screwed him out of his technology. And the ATK Force on Force cartridges have now been sold back to Simunition. And so Simunition controls what was developed by ATK as invented by Rick Huffman. And so there's really two competitors so far on the world stage. You've got Simunition, that owns both the Simunition brand of marking cartridges, which is the FX cartridge, and you've got UTM, that developed by a guy named Mike Saxby, brilliant inventor, that came up with an air cartridge design and tried to take us head on years ago, back in the early 90s, when he had something called the Saxby and Palmer tandem air cartridge. And so this thing was an air-powered little mini air cylinder that you'd pump up with something that looked like a bicycle pump, and you'd clip a projectile on the end. And once he saw our telescoping cartridge design, he thought, I can do that in an air cylinder. And he created a company called Air Munition, and it was ultimately a commercial failure. And then he went on to develop the UTM cartridge. And there was an interim primer-based cartridge called PyroSafe in the middle of that, and that went nowhere. But he came up with UTM and got the I guess it was the infantry school at Fort Benning, to buy into this and actually beat Simunition out of a $100 million contract that was pretty much all Simunition. That was a almost sole source, but Saxby said, I've got something that rivals that, and he beat Simunition at their own game. And so that was Mark Zero Mod Zero for a lot of this stuff, because once we had, predating the existence of this UTM cartridge, we had a great technology that the military said, no way will we ever use paintballs in training. Mm-hmm. And now they've got acronyms written around it in $100 million contracts. I think the Marine Corps called it SESAMS. The Army called it CCMCK. And so once you got an acronym in the military, you know you've arrived. But now, even to this day, the military does some really goofy, dangerous things in a post-force training. And that's troublesome. At Fort Joint Base McCord, what is it?
Lewis McCord.
Lewis McCord.
Yeah.
There was an accident this past Lewis McCord. There was a training accident where rather than shooting blanks, somebody loaded a belt of conventional munitions doing a post-force training and shot a soldier there. And I was out there running one of our 5-day schools for Tacoma PD and invited some of the Lewis McCord people to attend, and they got a lot out of it. But trying to get the military to understand that they're not really good at something is hard. Sure. I believe it was one of the old philosophers from Greek era said, you cannot teach a thing to a man that they believe they already know. Mm-hmm. And so part of my challenge over the past 4 decades is trying to get the attention of people that think they know it all in the training space. And we change one of 3 ways: evolution, psychotherapy, and emotionally significant events. And killing people does not seem to be enough. At the back of my book, Train at the Speed of Life, you can flip to the back pages, and there's 32 dead people that showed up for training and got shot to death in that training. The past 18 months, there have been 12 shootings in scenario-based training in this country, with 6 of them fatal. And yet people still think, let's just play by big boy rules. And the hubris just does not end. And those are just the ones that we're physically killing. What about the ones that in one way or another were preparing for failure because of the trunk monkeys and the ninjas and the jack-in-the-box moments that were playing around with the emotional system in people and creating risk-averse people and putting them to work in a risk-seeking profession.
Right. Yeah. Such an incredible technology and innovation. It is designed for simulating dangerous situations, and in dangerous situations, dangerous things can happen. And we're going to be talking about the safety aspects of reality-based training as well. But, before we dive into the specifics, I'd like to discuss the definitions. So we're on the same page on what we're talking about, whether it's simulations, simulated scenarios, reality-based training, simulators, what's the difference? So I'll start with my definitions of simulations, and I like to break it down into 2 definitions, because there's simulators and then there's simulations. And the simulators is essentially the hardware or the software, essentially the tool used to aid in the fidelity of the simulation. The realism of that tool is that it replicates either the fit, form, and function of the actual device used in the real world, or the fidelity of the psychology, the physiology of the experience itself. And so the fidelity of the simulator really is dependent on what the outcome result is, what you're looking for with the outcome of the result. And with the simulation, right, is the scenario itself that replicates a realistic situation at the appropriate fidelity, right? Ideally, it is controlled by an instructor who uses all the tools in the simulator to achieve that training objective as safely as possible. And we'll get into the different types of simulators, but I wanted to present my definitions of what a simulator is versus the simulation itself. And I'm curious as to
Sure.
your insight, what reality-based training actually means, and is there a difference between reality-based training and scenario-based training within a simulation?
Yeah, I guess I can start with that one, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
direct you and your audience to the RBTA website, which I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be putting that up, rbta.net. And if you go, there's an information drop down, and under that information drop down, there is a glossary of terms. It's a 50-page glossary to address this very question: is,
Mm-hmm.
what do things mean? Because a lot of times, like, I'm a big neurolinguistic programming guy. I've been studying NLP since the mid 80s, and language is an imperfect form of communication because it's experientially based. We go out into the world and experience things, and we bring them in through our five senses, and then we filter them into different places within our experiential internal world where we will delete, distort, and generalize, and then we come up with words that try to match our experience so that we can convey our understanding of that experience to other people. And words are very, very messy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's absent, thought balls that
Mm-hmm.
people talk about at the upper levels of spirituality type stuff, until we can get to the thought ball where I've got this experience I can just sort of send to you in a thought ball. I've got to come up with words to try to describe that for you. So I'm glad that you're starting there. Reality based training, according to the RBTA, is any tool, technology, or methodology that we utilize in a simulated setting to approximate the things that would exist in the actual world. And so synthetic worlds, we want to map as closely as possible to the world that we're playing around in. However, as we're trying to give people certain experiences, as they're trying to learn how to do something, one of the perceptions, and I've had deep discussions about this with some pretty smart people.
Mm-hmm.
One of the guys that I strongly admire is Dr. Bill Lewinsky, who was the founder of Force Science Research Center. And Bill and I have had this discussion off and on. He said, Ken, you are the training at the speed of life guy. And so
Mm-hmm.
should not simulations also happen at the speed of life? And that's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting construct. However, if I've got well trained people in a training
Mm-hmm.
environment and somebody's coming at them with a big shiny knife, walking towards them, I'm going to stab you with my big shiny knife, and they're not responding at that level, speeding it up and making it sneakier isn't going to do
Mm-hmm.
anything except overwhelm that person. There's an old saying that goes, you don't drown by falling in the water. You drown by staying in the water without the tools or ability to get your head above and out of the water and to get to a safer shore.
Mm-hmm.
And so when somebody's not responding to this, I'm within the limits that we teach. We've got all sorts of training philosophies and methodologies around this. But one of my big world, I guess the one of our philosophies, one of Kenny's maxims, is that if I could have a single patch that I could slap on the back of any candidate in any experiential learning so that others would look at it and remember it, it would be STFD, which stands for slow the down,
Mm-hmm.
which is the antithesis of train at
Right.
the speed of life,
Right.
right? Because Dr. Lewinsky, and understandably from where he's standing on that position, has been able to scientifically show that we need to learn a skill at the speed of threat. And I would add to that, I'd say we need to
Mm-hmm.
practice that eventually at the speed of threat and have that experience. But at the beginning of all of this, when you're going through overwhelmment, we need to take
Mm-hmm.
people to the edge of capacity
Right.
and learn what they can lift, right? If you've got
Mm-hmm.
somebody that can't lift 50 pounds and we try to put 60 pounds on there, they're going to get crushed. Not only are they going to get crushed, but they're not going to want to come back to the gym. And they may be unable to come back to the gym because we broke them. It's the same thing
Right.
psychologically, you see, is if we overwhelm people and then at the end of it all tell them, well, you should have done this and you should have done that. even if we do that in a kind fashion, that's
Mm-hmm.
not how the experience is going to be integrated into them. Human beings are risk aversive by their when they show up on the gates of birth, right? They are risk aversive, and we come into this world with four things that we are innately will respond to, knowing nothing about the planet, and that's loud noises, sudden approach, falling, and smothering.
Mm.
Every other fear is a weird word. Now the Inuit have 37 words for snow. We got one word for fear, and
Interesting.
it's badly used, right? And so a
Mm.
lot of times people will say the word fear, and other people will hear fear, and they'll
Mm.
process it based on their experience. And so I want to make sure that as people are on the precipice of uncertainty, fear, physiological fear, the tingly thing. You're never ever going
Mm.
to be paralyzed by fear, ever. You'll be paralyzed by anxiety. But the precipice of uncertainty, fear is a normal physiological reaction to danger, whether it's social danger or physical danger. Danger is very real. And
Mm-hmm.
at that precipice, you're going to get all tingly. And at that moment, the brain, not consciously, but unconsciously, as it's spinning around, sifting through the experiential Rolodex, is going to ask one question. Do I have a like experience? Do I have a map? Do I have the
Mm-hmm.
tools and talent to solve this situation, or do I not? If the answer is yes, you go to exhilaration. Whee! If
Mm-hmm.
the answer is no, you go to anxiety. Wah! It's like this wee wah meter. And we just sort of go through
Mm-hmm.
life sitting in the middle of the wee wah meter
Mm.
until we're
Interesting.
challenged with something. And then we either go wee or wah. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm coming at you with the big shiny knife and you don't have the tools, then all of a sudden your OODA loop turns into a hula hoop and you just go around and around and around
Mm.
going nowhere.
Yeah.
You're stuck. And at that moment, I want to press the pause button. We actually have this technique in the schools that we teach where I'm touching you gently on the shoulder and I'm saying pause. And at that moment, everything stops. My role player stops doing something and you stop doing things and the entire world stands still. And I can take you out of that uncertainty moment and find out very quickly if you've got the tools but you haven't consolidated them to this experience. We've
Mm-hmm.
given you tools but there was zero early context relevance to it, or you just don't know, you just didn't get that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't get that piece, we need to take you offline and teach it to you. If you do have that piece and we need to consolidate it, there's a lot of things going on in that space. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made, especially in the high pressure world of having to respond to high level danger. Right? Law
Mm-hmm.
enforcement is a very, very simple job. Once you get to the A in the OODA loop, you can talk, you can fight, you can shoot, or you can leave.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple. And so when you're at that situation, your brain starts to sift through going, what do I do here? Do I talk, fight, shoot, or leave? And if I fight, how do I fight? Am I going to use empty hand controls? Am I going to use the tools that I have on my belt? And the things that I'm doing, are they going to work? Are they going to not work? Are they going to kind of work? Or are they going to work and then be overcome? I need to have experiential responses to all of this and come up with what we call a 7 survival strategy that takes into consideration not just the physical win, but are you going to survive socially? Or is your community going to light the tiki torches and rise up against you? Are you going to win legally, both criminally and civilly? Are you going to
Mm-hmm.
win psychologically and emotionally? Are you going to win professionally? Are you going to win spiritually? Right? What are the wins financially? It's your city. I think it's Ferguson, Missouri. After the situation in Ferguson, Missouri, has spent billions of dollars, and the city is still smoldering. They can't keep a police chief, despite the
Mm-hmm.
fact that when you take apart all of the things that Officer Darren Wilson did were perfectly legal. Not only legal, they were the correct things to do. But because they didn't have a response to that at the time, they were reacting instead of responding. They lacked courageous leadership, and they blended law enforcement with um, allowing savagery. What needed to happen in that particular situation is for the city to say, look, you've got signs that say we want justice now. That's not how justice works. Justice is a process and it takes time. We cannot give you justice now. That's vengeance. And so what we will do is bring our city leaders together and give as much information as we know it when we know it. Meanwhile, if you choose to vocally protest this, we will protect with gunfire your right to do that. We're not going to allow anyone to stop you from doing that. However, should your protest turn kinetic and you start burning down our community, we will protect with gunfire our community and the peaceful desires of those who live within it. That didn't happen. In fact, I remember during the Freddie Gray situation in Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings, the mayor at the time, while her city was on fire, was saying, we need to give these people a place to burn things down so they can protest in their way, which is insanity.
Interesting.
Baltimore generally didn't want that, but because savages were allowed to go do savage things unrestricted, not okay. And so we have this interesting time in American history right now where for some reason savagery is allowed to prevail, and people, all they want to do is live in peace. And so law enforcement shoots and kills about 1,000 people a year. 1,000 people. And the vast 95 to 97% of those, when you look at the facts of that case, you go, yup, that's what needed to happen there, because that was the option that we had to stop that level of savagery quickly. The other 3%, once you begin to analyze it, you might go, well, I don't know, but it's explainable. And then you got a very, very small percentage where you just go, no, that never should have happened. That person shouldn't be on our team, and we want to find them and get them off our team also. And law enforcement is actually pretty good at that. They're pretty good at, after action, finding people that shouldn't be in their department and holding them criminally accountable. Good, they should. 1,000 people. Let's compare and contrast that with the medical profession, where there are over 250,000 instances of death by medical malpractice each year. 250,000. Where are the picket signs for defund the doctors? And I'm not saying that there should be any. I'm just saying that when you can contrast one with the other in high pressure, instantaneous decisions needing to be made that are a matter of life and death, one is vaunted and glorified and the other is pilloried and spat upon. It's not fair. Absolutely not fair. Same thing with the military. If we're going to send our military members overseas and put them in harm's way ostensibly for American interests, then we need to support them 100% when they do the right thing. I remember the early push into the Middle East, and I think it might have been the first Gulf War, when we embedded reporters with the troops. There was one instance I remember on TV where the Marines were going through a mosque that had been taken over by radicals, and there was a gunfight going on. And as the Marines were clearing, they were still in a hot instance, right? It's still ongoing. There was ongoing combat. And the SOP at the time is that if you've got combatants in place and they were not surrendering, you'd shoot them. And that's exactly what this Marine did. There was an enemy combatant that was playing possum, and you guys learned from the hard lessons of folks like that. If you pass them by, they'd do something when you weren't looking. And so the SOP was shoot everybody, right? Shoot them again until it's rendered a safe operation. Well, this guy was playing possum. A Marine shot him, and it went out over CNN. And the Americans went, oh my gosh, this is horrible. This guy was not an enemy combatant. He didn't have a weapon. And they actually court-martialed this poor Marine. It worked out. I mean, he was exonerated when all was said and done. But the fact that America would be cowed into thinking that this Marine had somehow done something wrong was a really interesting it was a curiosity to me, because that same week on CNN, you had an AC-130 gunship up there, and you're looking at things going on the ground where these enemy combatants are placing IEDs, and up comes the AC-130 gunship. You're cleared hot, and they start shooting at these guys, and they blew up this area where they were in, and you see a couple of them that drop weapons and go running away, and they scope in on that guy and light him up again with a little bit of white phosphorus, right? Now, You see that, and America goes, yeah, look at that. Wow, get him, get him. But what is the difference between shooting that guy with a gunship or shooting this guy with an M4 within the same week? We're at war. And at war, there's going to be casualties on both sides. They're going to try and kill us. We're going to try and kill them. But as far as things go, just war is one of the things that Americans have been involved in. And you know, we don't or shouldn't be murdering innocents. And if somebody gives up, we let them give up. We've always done that. And when we don't do that, we hold people accountable for that. And so society is really schizophrenic right now and being moved in a direction by opinion-driven media. And it becomes a very, very dangerous time in America. And so when we come back to the training aspects for all of these things, hey, society, what do you want us to train the people that are putting themselves in harm's way for your benefit? What do you want them to do? Because we'll train them to do whatever you want. You know, the Reality-Based Training Association, all of the three arrows they see in that logo for military, law enforcement, emergency services are all circumscribed by a silver exterior, which represents society. So that all of our services are still proscribed within the requirements of society. So within that, tell us what you want us to do, and we'll do that. When you jump up and down and say defund the police, don't be surprised when the police stop coming. And when we put officers into a training environment, we have an obligation of them, morally, ethically, civically, to give them every single tool and every single ability that money can buy to give them the best training to prepare them for those moments of greatest dread when their brain is spinning around trying to find something to glom onto, and that's where experiential training comes in. The Marine Corps led the way out at 29 Palms with taking a concept that took my concepts and sort of put them into hyperdrive. Stu Siegel out at his studios in San Diego created something that he called hyper-realistic training. Stu was a visionary. He was a movie producer, still is. And at Stu Siegel Studios, he took his back lot and allowed the San Diego Police Department to build a training center back there. And he built, utilizing movie set making magic, he produced some really, really cool venues that were very realistic. And so the San Diego PD SWAT guys would be training in there. And then when the Gulf War broke out, there was an actor's strike or a writer's strike, some sort of Hollywood strike going on. And he didn't want to fire all his people, so he turned his backlot into Little Fallujah and was able to start giving the Marine Corps the ability to have highly realistic training. And so if some guy stepped out with an RPG, he'd fire an RPG at you, and a rocket on a rope, little fishing line becomes going past you, and boom, there'd be an explosion. And some Marine might step on a mine. He'd be an actor embedded with the Marines and blow his leg off. They'd hire amputees for this role, and his leg would go helicoptering through, and a corpsman would have to come and put tourniquets on some squirting arterial bleed. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing, and they replicated all of that at 29 Palms on a much larger scale, and they did an A/B study. When Marines went overseas, who did better in combat and in coming back home to society? The people with our conventional training or the people who had gone through the hyper-realistic training? And it was a no-brainer. It wasn't even a contest. The hyper-realistic training created pre-combat veterans, and it was very, very telling.
Yeah, interesting. I've been through that training with the simulated RPGs on the string, from second-story buildings down to the ground level, explosions and amputated role players bleeding in the streets. It was quite chaotic. So I know exactly what you mean. Let me try to go back. There was a lot of incredibly insightful information. I'd like to try to regurgitate at least the definition of reality-based training. So from my understanding, it's the appropriate use of the tools, technologies, and methodologies within a simulated environment, right? And it's not necessarily at the speed of threat, but maybe a crawl, walk, run, experiential learning. There's the zone of proximal development where There's a ceiling of the individual. It's very individualistic training
Yes.
methodology, where the design keeps the challenge of the situation, the scenarios, and the training under the ceiling of understanding from the trainee. And then the exposure to stresses, right? Not necessarily stress inoculation, but at least the experiences of stress. And then ultimately designed to test and potentially vet within an organization.
I really like the way you put a lot of that, and certainly
Mm-hmm.
within that bandwidth of where where is Jared within this particular skill set.
Mm-hmm.
You would never even consider giving the identical workout regimen to 10 different people.
Mm-hmm.
You'd scale it to the needs and capacities of each of those 10, and put a lot of different things into their rest profiles, their nutrition profiles, their workout
Mm-hmm.
profiles. Maybe we're rehabbing an injury. Whatever it is, it would be tailored to the individual needs of each person, each individual. And the institutional training methodologies are not good at that. They're taking a volume of people and pretty much a one size fits all, moving a volume of people through
Mm-hmm.
all of this, thinking that we don't have time for this. And I say we don't have time not to. Where we have you ever seen an image of a hamster running on one of those little hamster wheels? Little
Yeah.
hamster's running around and around and around on this little cage, and he's going really fast, but he's going absolutely nowhere. And if he goes too fast, he actually spins himself backwards because
Mm-hmm.
he's going faster than the wheel. And so, a lot of ways, that's what a lot of institutional training does. We've got studies now, thanks to Force Science and their compatriots around the academic world, to show that the block training methodology, the siloed training that occurs, is not effective. We're trying to put a lot of information into somebody within contracted periods of time. And if you think of it in terms of learning a musical instrument or learning a martial art or learning a language, you'd never do that with any of those things and expect
Mm-hmm.
people to have a firm understanding or the ability to respond within their sport, language, or playing of music. Carlos Santana once said, "You cannot learn to play quickly."
Mm-hmm.
And it was just this really insightful thing that even if you're a guitar aficionado that has perfect pitch, you could listen to some organic Santana joint and try to replicate it. But you'd have to sort of bracket it in and try to work out this first measure. And you'd play that piece first, and then you'd take the second measure and you'd learn that, and you'd put those two together, and then on and on for all of these things and learn it note for note. Only then could you really excel at improvisation within that piece. We're expecting people to improvise without teaching them how to play.
Mm-hmm.
We're expecting that people are going to be fluent without learning basic vocabulary. And it's not fair, Jared.
Right. So would you say that reality based training, scenario based training should be designed to test physical skills that were or lessons learned within a traditional fashion and develop mental skills within those scenarios?
Sure. And one of the things for science in their methods of instruction course for anyone
Mm-hmm.
who's studying this stuff deliberately, um, the MOI course, Methods of Instruction, developed by Chris Butler up in Canada. Now, For Science is sort of teaching it in America. They talk about early context relevance. So, as soon as you know how to do something at its basic level, uh, repetition is not the way to getting your best outcome. Experts replicate outcomes, not techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the training that goes on is technique driven. Once we learn a technique good enough to be able to do it, we need to put it into context relevance, and then we need to be able to blend it together utilizing variable practice to get things good enough and put them into action. And that's one of the things that a lot of folks don't know how to do very well, because this is all relatively new in the
Mm-hmm.
world of sports psychology and also in the world of dynamic gunfight training. And that's just for the gunfight portion. It's the same thing for talking. Talking is a skill set. John Azar Dickens, who was a Rome, Georgia psychologist, became a police officer and started utilizing psychological principles to teach police officers how to respond to people in crisis. And he came up with something called the TEB model: thinking, emotions, and behaviors. And by doing the various permutations of thinking, whether it's clear or contaminated, emotions being high or low, behavior being compliant or non-compliant, that will give you 8 different sets of personality traits that you can begin to study. I know when the Marine Corps was doing the left of bang stuff, they started looking at clusters of behaviors and what is it that seems like out of place, starting to look for the danger before you got to the danger. It's the same thing with the talking space. If you the big buzzword in law enforcement worlds these days is de-escalation. You got to de-escalate. Well, somebody's chasing you with a big shiny knife. There's no
Mm-hmm.
capacity for de-escalation because you can't contain it and it hasn't been controlled. Until you can't even begin to communicate until the situation's been contained and controlled. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is where the general public is completely lost, because they've been fed a daily serving of what they believe the police should be capable of doing. Same thing with soldiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They expect you to have superhero like abilities. You're human. You're just human. And so if an officer finds themselves in a situation and they don't have an experiential Rolodex card to be able to solve that situation, they go to wham, not we.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just start tripping over the saying of being over your skis comes to mind, or over driving your headlights. What means that it basically means that you're trying to do something that you're going too fast and you
Right.
can't keep up with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens there is that my STFD model fits within a 4 section um, model, if you would, uh, that one of my students, Dan Tolley from the Australian Commando Regiment, 2 Commando, I was trying to explain what I did to a commanding officer when I was over there one time, and I just couldn't explain it to him in a way that he understood. And Dan shows up with a pen and a paper, said, "It kind of
Mm-hmm.
looks like this, sir." And he shows this upward sloping graph and this time frame. Said, "You can overlay this on any time frame, whether it's 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. This is where we are. This is our end state. This is where we need to reach in order to get to the end state." And we have crawl, walk, run, and assess. And the crawl phase of all of this, the slowing down phase of it for skill and skill acquisition, is almost half of that time curve. And a lot of trainers find that really, really difficult. They think they're going to run out of time
Mm-hmm.
slowing down in the beginning. But what always happens is, if you apply this model from an educated perspective and you understand how to work the model, you end up with time left over and skill sets that are much higher. And so it's really interesting that bandwidth of, if we were to look at that XY graph and we got, here's where we don't know anything, here's where we're good enough to get a Sandy Beret and a cap badge. And
Mm-hmm.
so what often happens is that I'll go back to the ratios of Heraclitus, the Peloponnesian philosopher, who said out of 100 people in combat, 10 shouldn't be there. 8 are just targets, 9 are good fighters, and we're lucky to have them, for they make the battle. But the one is a
Mm-hmm.
warrior. We got to find him. He's going to bring everybody home.
Mm-hmm.
The nines and the ones live on a graph that look like straight up. It goes boom, here from straight up looking like that. Here's where the 80s and the 10s live. They are like this, and they're going slowly, 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 and then we'll eventually ramp up. So this is the 80s and 10s curve. This is the nines and the ones curve. Now, the nines and the ones typically find themselves in the trainer roles. And quite often, they will hold the 80s and the 10s to the standard of the nines and the ones.
Mm-hmm.
What's wrong with you? Why aren't you getting this? This is so easy for me. Just aim harder. Aim harder. What?
Right.
You aim harder. Doing the
Mm-hmm.
best I can. And so we make we make the right thing simpler. We make the right thing easier. If I've got somebody that I'm just teaching basic shooting to, if they can't hit a target from 15 feet, I'll move them to 3. I'll take away the great big jumpy gun. Remember, loud noises, sudden approach, falling, and smothering are the things that we are limbically responding to. Well, a gun makes a big noise. The slide comes back at your eye. You've got a firearms instructor right over top of your shoulder, so you feel his close presence. The only thing we're not doing is dropping you off a rappel tower to activate falling. We're activating all 3 of our primal fears, 3 of the 4, and then expecting that somehow that level of pressure is going to allow them to rise to the top. Doesn't work like that. And so what happens is, because we are organically risk aversive, there's survival value in risk aversion. There's no survival value in seeking risk. None. And so we've got to overcome the organic reluctance to going out and searching for dangerous things. And we need to do that in a managed, balanced approach. And most of our people, the population centers are among the 10 and the 80, not the 9s and the 1s. The 9s and the 1s, if you're trying to teach them how to do special forces stuff, you could toss them a DVD, some guns and some bullets and some rope, and just go, all right, we'll see you in 3 months. And they'd work it out. That's not going to happen with the 10s and the 80s. They have to be mentored all the way along. And as they start to stumble, we need to slow down and figure this out and consolidate this thing. Right. You've got natural athletes in any space. And so we need to be more attuned as trainers to who we're dealing with. And then you're going to have people listening to this podcast and, well, we shouldn't be selecting from anybody but the 9s and the 1s. I disagree. And I would, we don't have the bandwidth on this podcast to go deeply into that, but I'll have a roundtable discussion with anybody that believes that on your show anytime they want to challenge that.
Interesting. Yeah. This concept of master apprentice and specific guidance, mentor, mentee reminds me of a knight and his squire. And although the basics of combat are very minimal when it comes to hand and steel and bellies, to the sophisticated tools, technologies, and methodologies of today. And I see this revolution, or this evolutionary revolution of the going into the science and technology, science-based and evidence-based of the technology, and developing skills and the science of skills transfer. But the concept of simulated environments and simulated tools is not a new concept. It's the history of the reality-based training or simulators. And although the verbiage and maybe the science and research wasn't available to back up the concepts of evidence-based, but I do want to talk about, and I think there's value in discussion in these 2 examples that I'd like to present to you, as the core of simulation training remains constant, which is the development of hard and soft skills, but the landscape and the tools used have just changed. So for instance, tabletop war games such as Tafel in the 4th century, which is a European strategic game of defense versus offense in a chess-like mechanic of capturing pieces until either the king is captured or the king escapes the battlefield. And then, eventually chess came out in the 7th century, and anyone who knows me knows of my passion for chess. And chess was a strategic war game of sorts taught to Persian nobility. And it's argued that it, may have originated from India, but I have a bias because, my father is of Persian heritage. So I'll fight that argument all day long. But it's a simulation of war and life for the soft skills developed or development of strategic planning, critical thinking under time restrictions, risk mitigation and risk management, and the weight of consequences. And some decisions I've made in chess made it highly improbable of winning, and even the fidelity of fostering the mental fortitude to never give up in a dire situation, because even when the cards are stacked against me, and I've blundered valuable pieces, I have come back and still won games. So this is the concept of developing and fostering soft skills within a simulated environment. And the fidelity is not necessarily physical, but it's more experiential and mental. And again, back to the knight and squire, during medieval training, they would use a device called the quintain, or quinton, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. And it was a tool to train mounted troops, the physical skills of hitting a target with a lance. And it essentially looked like a big scarecrow that could revolve and spin in a 360 manner. And protruding out of either end of it was fashioned, protruding out of either end was a long wooden beam. And on one end, they would mount typically a shield or some sort of target, and on the other end was a hanging bag of sand, somewhat of a counterweight. And they would practice hitting this target, and it wasn't only for the knight or the mounted troops, but it was also training for the horse as well. So there's secondary and tertiary training elements to it. Fast forward to today, the evolution of the modern day simulations and firearms training simulators. Although we don't use swords and shields anymore, or lances, these systems are still designed through experiences to develop those skills and foster the hard skills and soft skills. So I'm curious as to your insights on the challenge of adoption, because I know you were talking about with simulated ammunition, there was a challenge within the military adopting this type of simulation method. And even though the technology changes, simulations haven't changed. Or the use or need of simulation. Why do we see this? I guess typically as humans, we don't like to adapt to change, but yet we've been utilizing simulations throughout history.
Yeah, simulation is necessary because I think it was Patton in the Patton papers said something about the successful soldier must be educated to say charge, for the man is not born who can say it out of hand. It's a wonderful discussion about getting people to imagine plunging their sword hilt into the breastplate of the enemy, because only once we have developed momentary and calculated savagery can we, divest ourselves of all restraint and hurl ourselves upon the enemy, a frenzied brute lusting to probe our foeman's guts with 3 feet of steel or shatter his brains with a bullet. And it can't be done without schooling yourself to that savagery, without actually practicing those things. And so Patton recognized that. The Romans recognized that, in that at the time of the Roman conquests, because we have this organic reluctance to killing our own kind. Grossman talks about this in On Killing, that we're not genetically coded to kill our own kind. And so there's only like 1 or 2% that just have that capacity organically to be able to, I'll kill that guy. And we got to find them and train that, rather than have them go off and find themselves the enemies of society. And so what the Romans found is that there was this reluctance to shoving steel into somebody. And so they came up with the straw dummies to give you that feeling of the resistance of a sword going through somebody rather than just the slashing. So there was a lot of slashing that was going on that wasn't really effective. But once they started piercing with the swords, they came up with one of the most fearsome fighting forces in the history of mankind, because they were getting really, really good at doing that. It was said that the centurions would have to, one of their largest jobs was to ride around in a chariot and direct the fighting, because if they weren't there, it was like a big shoving match. People were reluctant to kill one another, and they'd have to show up and go, no, you stab that guy. And on the Second World War battlefields, the presence of the commander in the trenches inspired people to actually shoot towards the enemy, whereas when they weren't there, the volume of fire, and certainly the volume of accurate fire dropped. That was Men Against Fire by S.L.A. Marshall, talked a lot about that. Great book. And so the utility of the simulator can move us towards some of that schooling yourself to savagery and practicing the act of doing things. Tabletop exercises are interesting from a psychological perspective, but I'm also drawn to the original recipe Star Trek episodes. And the Star Trek, there was this one episode where they found themselves on a planet where they would be playing these computer war simulations. And the society would hear, oh, incoming attack from the whatevers. And they'd all run for cover and hide, and they'd be able to, through technology, discover how many people were killed during that attack. And then these people would have to report to the disintegration chambers. And what? Oh, yeah, no, you guys were killed in that battle, and so now you got to go and be disintegrated. And people would just willfully walk along and go get into these disintegration chambers. And it was the Starship Enterprise that got them back to the bloody brutality of actual combat. They say, we're going to take that away from you. So now if you want to fight each other, you got to go fight each other. And it turned them more into a peaceful planet, because people don't like the brutality unless they've been schooled to brutality. And just like shoplifting, some little kid has this, oh my gosh, I just stole a pack of gum. But that adrenaline hit begins to wear off. Now he's got to go steal something else and steal something else and steal something else. There's this indoctrination to the adrenaline hits that come from doing dangerous things. And eventually we become schooled to savagery. There's a great movie called, it'll come to me in a second, My Archivist is going to go get that. I got a brain part that's going to go get that. And James Gandolfini was in it. True Romance. Thank you, Archivist. I've got this part of my brain that goes fine. So, True Romance. And you had Christian Slater, and I can't remember the name of the girl. She was some twin back in the time. Anyway, Gandolfini is a mob guy. And Christian Slater accidentally ended up with a bunch of stolen cocaine that he now goes out to Hollywood to have his friend help sell this stuff off. Well, the mob figures out they've got this stuff, and they send some of their assassins out to LA to find him. And Gandolfini finds the hotel room. Clarence, the dude isn't there. The woman is there, and he's sitting in the hotel room when she comes back. He's gone off to get a hamburger or something. And he's sitting there going, hey, Alabama Whirly. Hey, Alabama, where's our Coke? I know you guys have it. I came here to get it. Where is it? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any Coke. Get you a Diet Pepsi, though. So, I mean, she's really trying to play it down. And he just ends up beating her up. And it's this really brutal beating scene. And he's put her through some glass, and she's laying on the floor. She can barely breathe, and she's bleeding. And he's going to kill her. He found the suitcase under the bed, and he's going to kill her. But he's sitting to have a cigarette. And he's just having this cathartic moment with her. And I'll always remember the soliloquy. He said, the first time you kill somebody, that's the hardest. I don't care if you're a Wyatt Earp or Jack the Ripper. First one's tough. I threw up on my first one. Can you believe that? I said, second one. Second one's no Mardi either, but it's better than the first. It's more diluted. Gets better. Third one was easy. Leveled right off. Now I do it just to watch their expression change. And so what he was describing is this pathway that people that have this reluctance to killing other people, or even doing harm to other people, you can school yourself to savagery, as Patton talked about. And simulators it can in many ways help us psychologically, intellectually find our way through that pathway. And now that they've got these video simulators that are wrapping us around, Vertra sells their 5-screen simulator that ostensibly puts you in the center of the action. It doesn't really. It's a kind of a flat screen that wraps around you. So there's some immersion, which is good. It's an interesting technology. The facilitation is the big thing of those experiences. If you don't know how to facilitate the experiences, these synthetic experiences, then it's just a video game. And then you've got augmented reality and you've got virtual reality where you're wearing a set of goggles and you're actually in an environment. I've watched the growth of those over the years. It keeps getting a little bit better. But you still can't choke a hologram, right? You can't go up and feel the resistance of shoving a knife into another human being. And so they have their place, and they can certainly get your physiology and your psychology involved, but there's nothing quite like human against human, where you and I are facing one another as actual flesh and blood foes. The thing is, too much scenario-based training, we'll differentiate between live action scenario-based training and some of the scenario-based training that's on video screens. The actual live action scenario-based training where you and I are doing something against each other ought not be a competition. When we get into a level of that we call near peer training, then it's more of a competition. Then it's more of a scrimmage where you're trying to win and I'm trying to win. But at the early phases of learning how to do this, your role player has to be tightly scripted, looks very realistic, and it's their job to draw out performance-based behaviors that we've already taught you at a different level. Don't test something they haven't learned how to do, because all you're doing is practicing potential failure. And then once we give them early context relevance within this experiential force on force, this person versus person, it's the role player's job to lose 100% of the time. And quite often in early days of scenario-based training, the role players would be people that wanted to do target practice against the initiates. And so you had all of these SWAT guys used to love being role players because they'd be able to have fresh meat for the slaughter. And I remember one of the early questions in the early days of this, is it better to have cops as role players or civilians? Because if you use cops, they know the countermeasures. Well, they should know the countermeasures. They should know what they're looking at as they're trying to draw out these behaviors from the lesser mortal that they're training.
Yeah. It sounds more like
and so they need to have the ego strength to lose. Well, they need to have the ego strength to lose when proper response has been demonstrated.
Yeah. Sounds like actors should be more role players than civilians.
100% agree.
Yeah. It's interesting point that you brought up, because I do want to go into the integration of reality-based training or scenario-based training, whether it's live action or virtual. And there is a shift in this mass adoption, and just so I can regurgitate and see if I got this correct. You were talking about it starts with leadership adoption, and then the integration and application within the curriculum for using simulators and simulation systems. And so typically, it starts off in a full cycle training evolution or traditional training. It starts off, within the classroom instruction or period of instruction, right? The knowledge is being passed down through words and discussion and Q&As. And at this point, the knowledge is really just theoretical to the trainee because they haven't practiced it before. They haven't done it before. Then it might roll into a practical exercise for basic hands-on, right? Whether it's learning physical techniques or taking lessons learned in an experiential fashion through trial and error. Maybe something like shooting moving targets at unknown speeds and distances. A lot of experiential practice goes into that. And then it might roll into a culminated field exercise to test those lessons learned. Maybe it's a live tissue training course, and the students are running full medical evaluations and treatments based on those individual modules and practical applications. And I've broken down the simulators into a couple of categories, right? So you've got your physical simulators, right? Whether it's a laser engagement, simulated ammunition, medical dummies, or systems such as AU fires, neuromuscular injury simulator, where it emits electroshocks, renders the limb immobilized to simulate, blunt trauma or a gunshot wound, etc. Then you have your computer-based or computer task-based simulations, such as maybe an emergency management or incident command. And then you have your hybrid trainers, such as flight simulators, where it's part physical, such as the cockpit, and its entirety is replicated of an actual cockpit of whatever system you're flying. And then there's the visual representation, digitally rendered flight. And then you have, like you had mentioned, the projection-based systems, such as the Virtua systems, and then you have VR, AR, right? And so with this traditional training experience or traditional practice, and then you have reality-based training, I'd like to go into best practices of integrating reality-based training, as well as building effective scenarios, because I think that's incredibly important. Like you had brought up, there's science behind it. There's a method to the madness. With the crawl, walk, run. There's the utilization of the debriefing, right? So you've got the pre-brief, you've got the control during the scenario, you've got the after action, the after action review for debriefing. So how do you integrate reality-based training into your full cycle curricula?
Well, that's interesting because I mostly work with trainers. And so I'm not building full cycle curricula.
Gotcha.
I'm helping guide them to optimize the full cycle curricula that they have. And typically when I look across the wide spectrum of organizations, they're still very mired in the siloed driven training structures and have a really hard time getting out of that. And that's the problem, because they've got a volume of students, and how do they completely revamp the 900 hours that goes into police academy, for example, and where do all of these things fit? The RBTA, and more specifically Rick Furr, who has been working with me for years. I met Rick. He was the range master at Scottsdale Police Department for years. He was one of Jeff Cooper's early students and friends, and he ended up teaching for Jeff Cooper and then teaching for not only Gunsight but Thunder Ranch with Clint Smith, and just one of the most knowledgeable gun guys. He saw some value in the marking cartridges and some of the frangible technologies we were bringing to the market in the early 90s, and he just got it. And so he and I have been teaching together for years. And the thing about gunfight training is that typically in the police academy, they take you and put you through a block of firearms training. Once again, you'd never do that to learn a language or a martial art or anything that you need durable learning within. I don't want to pack a bunch of information into you and say, yeah, we did that. Now you know how to shoot. And a lot of, still to this day, in classes, I've been asking this question for 30 years. Show of hands, how many people believe that qualification is a great measurement of gunfight proficiency? And no hands go up ever. And yet we're still doing it. And so how do we move from that if at the basic level, people that believe doesn't work is still being used? You started to ask about leadership and how we need to integrate this with leadership. Well, quite often in my classes, I'll get the comment after the first couple of days that, who needs to be here are the administrators. And my hip pocket response to that is always, I have a room full of administrators. You're just not sitting in that chair yet. And so when you sit in that chair, you need to remember this, and you need to go back and look back and say, we need to take it all apart. We're missing the boat because we are standing on the wrong dock and the ship ain't coming here. And so if the ship, the end state, is good quality performance on the street, we need to start looking and doing different things. And a lot of administrators will look at the simulator world and say, I can use that thing there. Get me that Gnip to come in, and that'll be our judgmental simulation training system, and that's how we're going to handle that. Mm-hmm. And so they'll write a big check once, thinking that the machine does all the work. In Plato's Republic, Socrates, who was talking about the use of various tools, weaponry being one of them, said that weapons or tools that would teach a man their own use would be beyond price. And so just because you can go and experience the video game aspects of a simulator doesn't mean that you're going to integrate the experience in a useful way. You utilize the example of the flight simulators. For years, the flight simulators, and still to this day, some of the more advanced flight simulators, they can damn near put you upside down. They can recreate almost every flight emergency, every in-flight emergency there are. And what they were doing is teaching people to solve that particular problem, and then the simulation would end. They would never land the aircraft after that engaging event. And what they found through FAA studies, and the FAA are really, really good at this, studying what happens out there based on the trainings that they provided. What they found is that people could get through the crisis, but they would then damn near crash the plane where they're bringing it for a landing. And so all of those complicated events now have to culminate in landing the aircraft safely. And so that's the evolution that the FAA put into it. And that's one of the things that we talk about in any critical incident through the trainings we provide with the RBTA is there's three natural conclusions to a scenario. Everybody makes nice and goes home. So it's basically talk and walk. There's going to be a custodial seizure, and you can either take it all the way through the custodial seizure or to the point of custodial seizure. It depends on what you're testing. We're very, very big on end state. Or the third one is there's a critical incident and the offender is dead, dying, or damaged, and you're in a position of advantage going through what we call our 4C checklist. That they're communication, condition, controlled breathing, and cover. And there's about 4 aspects to each of those things. Communication. Who are you talking to and what are you saying? A lot of people in simulations have a hard time getting on the air and getting things out, including that they're okay. If you're in a crisis situation, you've been in a gunfight, you get on the air and you go, shots fired by police, shots fired by police and offender, and then let go of that button. In many radio systems, you lose your turn. And so people are going to start marshaling a response in your direction, but not letting them know that you're okay could have catastrophic consequences for people on the way there, trying to get there as quickly as possible and blowing through red lights, trying to get to you as quickly as they can. Shots fired by the police, I'm okay, start stacking to the north. That's a lot of information. In aviation, as a young pilot, I'm very reluctant to get on the air. It's very common for pilots as they're flying an airplane to start talking air traffic control. Very simple. Air traffic control wants to know 3 things. Who are you? Where are you? What do you want? And it's the same thing in law enforcement communications. Who are you? Where are you? What do you want? And utilizing the 4 C's aspect of that, of cover. Do you have lethal cover pointing at someone that just tried to do you lethal harm? Do you have cover units coming? Are you behind some hard physical cover? Condition. What's the condition of the situation? Who needs to know? What's your condition? And are you aware of that? You could be shot and not know it and exsanguinate and bleeding all over the place with no understanding that that's happened because your mind is paying attention to other things. You're attending to a lethal threat, not attending to the fact that you've been shot. What's the condition of your weapon system? Are you up? Are you ready to re-engage if necessary? I can't tell you the number of simulations that I've observed where you've got, again, I train trainers for the most part, and there I've got a trainer standing there behind what he considers to be lethal cover, but his weapon has malfunctioned, or he's in lockback, or just absolutely unaware of the condition of his weapon system. And so communicating to the offender, communicating to any partner that you have, communicating to any observers or bystanders. There are communication things that need to be known, communicating to your response system. And the controlled breathing. We've talked for years about the box breathing, the combat breathing. Dave Grossman talks a lot about that in his various teachings about that 4-count pattern breathing. Breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out for 4, holding for 4. That's an interesting method that is going to bring your physiology and psychology back under your control, but in a hyperventilated situation, it's very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And so when we start looking at the stuff that Huberman talks about with this, the physiological or the physiological sigh, the breathing in through your nose and then another sip, so it's and then blowing it out. It has effects on the vagal system, which is going to start bringing your physiology under control. If we control our physiology, it will change our psychology. If we change our psychology, it will impact our physiology. And so that internal communication, the I'm going to be okay, or the realization of your physiological state in relationship to the fact that you are injured, and people need to know that, letting yourself know that you're going to be okay, utilizing some of these tools. You're in the water, but splashing around in the water is not going to save your life. Having the tools to get yourself out of the water is what's going to save your life. And so in a scenario environment, if people are splashing around, there's no value in letting them drown. And this is metaphorically, of course, but even physiologically. Don't take your kid out to the middle of the lake and kick him off the boat expecting he's going to learn how to swim. I've got a book that I'm working on, and I don't know. Writing books is easy. Finishing them is really hard. The book is entitled The Art of Pretending. And rule number 1 in The Art of Pretending is don't be an asshole. If you're trying to teach somebody a skill set, don't be a dick to them. There's no training value in being a dick to them unless you're deliberately being a dick to have them practice how to manage their emotional system in the presence of a dick. I see that this is saying, are we still here? I think we've frozen again.
Oh, we're back. I hear you.
Yeah, okay. I saw it spinning around and saying it was lost connection again. And so, right. Rule number 1 in The Art of Pretending is don't be a dick. Unless you're giving someone the experience of what it's like to be dealing with a dick. But then if you're being a dick, you're being a simulated dick for a specific purpose. And so rule number 3 is don't pretend with people who also are not pretending. It's just, that's a good rule for life.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just kidding. Yeah. Well, you got punched in the face. You'd see all these punk videos.
Right? Yeah. That's where my mind went.
There are people doing goofy things to you to get a response from you. And that response might be a bullet in your noggin. Right. There was a guy in Virginia recently. I saw something on the Law of Self-Defense podcast with just a really, really good podcast where he was reviewing this couple of guys punking somebody at a fast food place in the mall and just trying to thug him out. And this guy pulled out a gun and shot one. Yeah. And if you're going to be a dick, chances are you're run into the wrong person in that environment. And so there's lots of things that if we're trying to, for years they're talking about stress inoculation. The stress inoculation, if we're going to be putting people in stressful situations, it needs to be contextual and it needs to be graduated. It's just, we need to put the right amount of weight on somebody's metaphoric bar, or you're just going to crush them otherwise. And so there really is an art to the experiential training realm, and there need to be properly structured, properly written, properly presented scenarios that are end state driven. If we don't have the scripting of the scenarios, and we don't know what the people being subjected to that experience are going to do, that's not experiential training, that's experimental training. Experiments blow up. And so if we don't know what to expect, and we don't know what the role player is deliberately, specifically doing because we've scripted him to be doing these things, then it's anything can happen day, and that's not safe. It's not safe physiologically, it's not safe emotionally. And so we need to script and structure our scenarios appropriately. But when we do that, and we take, rather than the approach of what are we going to do in block training this year, if we build a reality-based training program, most agencies have projects. I want to build programs that have longevity. So rather than asking, what are we going to do in block training this year? I'm asking, where is Jared in the progression of a 7-year managed training profile? Well, he's just a year one guy. Okay, so we do scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Year two guy gets scenarios 4, 5, and 6, which are strangely similar to scenarios 1, 2, and 3, but there's a little bit more desirable difficulty built into those things. If we take that 7-year approach, then we're taking the 9s and the 1s. We have to have some desirable difficulties built into there that are going to challenge the 9s and the 1s. But most of it should be structured to the 10s and the 80s who are doing this, not that. And if we go slow, we'll end up a lot quicker with a lot more confident and competent people at the end of that 7-year period. And the other thing that organizations, 99.9% of organizations across America have no actuarial connection between their use of force reporting for things that people are doing on the street and the training that they've been provided. And until you can't measure success unless you contrast it against failure. And unless we know where we were organizationally as to what it was costing us in terms of stress and the losses of officers to stress disorders or stress injuries or physiological injuries, both to our officers and the people that we're interacting with, unless we know where we're at and we measure over a 5 to 7 year period what we're doing to have a causal connection between what we're doing and the effect it's having on the street, how do we measure that? All we see 7 years down the road is, oh, we're doing pretty good at this now. What happened? Well, we should be able to look back and show what happened. Say, here's the training that we were doing all along the way. Here's the use of force reporting with these officers, and to have this causal connectivity, some connective tissue between what we're doing and what they're doing.
Yeah. Interesting. There's key takeaway, right? Responsibility lies with the instructor, right? Get away from siloed training and more integrated, full procedural, from start to finish training. Because, I've worked with systems before where, whether it's a escalation, you draw, you fire, and then the scenario ends. And you do that over and over and over again, similar to your flight simulator situation. And there's no, there's no after action of flight to land. There's no shots fired to what next in the training cycle. Like you said, there's an art to the experience. There's with end state driven and individually developed, designed and tailored to the individual zone of proximal development, and just the progression through in a program and an end state of where you'd like to get them to, which is the 9, the 10, right? So, with all of this said, right? So I'm an instructor. I know what reality-based training is. I have the tools, the simulators, the simulated scenarios developed. What safety considerations and challenges would I have as an instructor within the environment because, like you had mentioned, there was the incident not too long ago, and it's constant and continuous in these dangerous situations, these dangerous simulations. There's incidences of injury and death during the training.
Mm.
And like you had mentioned, just yesterday, the report of JBLM, Joint Base Lewis McChord, a soldier was shot during training in a force-on-force scenario where blanks were supposed to be used, but somehow live ammunition found its way into the mix, and as a result, one of the soldiers was shot and wounded. So, first question: what? Obviously, this is a safety consideration. How are these challenges addressed and mitigated if they can't
Well,
be prevented?
well, that's an interesting question. There's a book called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why by Lawrence Gonzalez. Interesting book.
Mm,
Talks about all sorts of different instances of people finding themselves in dangerous situations, ice climbers that fall, pilots that crash, all sorts of things. And one of the things Gonzalez said is that in any high risk endeavor,
mm,
if you're going to have mountain climbing, you're going to have people falling to their death. If you're going to have surfing, you're going to have drownings. He said that as
mm,
part of the dangerous game that is being played, there are going to be catastrophes. He said as part of the system. And
mm,
that was really troubling to me, is that I'm a zero consequence guy. Like when I would talk about consequence, dangerous,
mm,
stupid consequences, because
mm,
every single
mm.
one of the deaths in the back of your book that you're
Preventable.
got there,
Mm,
all preventable, 100%
mm,
preventable. And if
mm,
Gonzalez says that if there's going to be experiential force on force training, there's going to be fatalities because there
mm,
is the danger built into the system.
mm,
But he said something interesting that was the more liberating thing. He said, but they don't have to happen to you and me. That we
mm.
can put
Interesting.
systems in place independently that can move us away from the danger. He
Mm,
talks about climbers on Mount Hood that had this belief system that in mountaineering you'll have four climbers on a rock face and they'll all link themselves together, and they think that a fall by one of them will be arrested by the hard points of the others, and so there will be one person climbing at a time, and should he fall, the others keep him safe. He said, but the thing that wasn't taken into consideration was, what if you get a top fall?
mm.
And so let's say you got 10 feet of rope between you and the other climber. And so you'll have a 20-foot fall. If the top climber falls
Right.
at the apex of his
It's that extra
capacity to
distance.
climb with the rope,
Mm,
yep,
mm,
he's essentially falling 20 feet. And that's the
mm,
weight of a dump truck on
mm.
the end of his rope. And there's no connection point that man can stick an ice axe into that's going to arrest that fall. And so he said the climbers on Mount Hood were set up for failure not by their inexperience, but
Mm,
rather by their experience. The fact that they knew, coupled with a system that had worked so many times before. It's like the or the white swan event or the black swan event, right? That you can Vegas odds say that 50% of the time is going to come up black and 50% of the time is going to come up red. But that's not a mathematical fact.
mm,
In an infinite world where you had an infinite number of coin flips, it'll be heads 50%, tails 50%. But that's not an actual
right.
fact, that it could stay
Mm,
heads until the end of time. Right. And so it's
right.
that black swan event where you're expecting it to be turning up heads and it comes up tails.
Mm,
That 1,000 times you
right.
flipped it and this coin is weighted. You just know that you've geeked the coin, and every time you toss it, it's going to come up heads. And
Mm,
then it comes up tails the one time, and you bet everything on that. And that's what happens in the training environment. Is that I was brought in as an expert witness against a Northeast agency. I won't name them, can't name them, but
mm,
they claimed to be shooting 30,000 rounds of marking cartridges in a 1 year period and never used face protection. They said, we have a gentleman's agreement that says no headshots, okay? And so
Mm,
the system that they put in place, they thought was going to be okay
right.
because they're thinking, we say no headshots. The rule is no headshots. Well, gunfights are dynamic. We aim
Mm,
at the present, we shoot at the past, and we hit the future. So unless you have a controlled firing lane where I'm dueling against you and
mm,
you're not moving, I might not shoot at your head. But by the time I release that shot, you've moved into a position where I wasn't shooting at.
mm,
So I moved my head down into a crouch position and you hit me in the face. Not wearing face protection and projectile based opposed force training is reckless.
mm,
And anyone that believes it is not reckless is wrong. And
mm,
I'll have that argument with you in court, and you will lose that argument in court because you are deliberately indifferent to the safety needs of the student that you're putting in harm's way.
mm,
And so they put their student in harm's way, and their student got shot in the face
mm,
in an unprotected face, and end up suing them as a result. My
mm,
client will always be end user safety.
mm,
And when it comes to projectile based training, face protection, throat protection, gloves, groin protection, let's protect the areas that are vulnerable. And then in the event you get shot in one of the areas that these things hurt, they're going to leave welts on your skin. No unprotected flesh as far as I'm concerned. But I look at military organizations that are running around in Bud shorts,
mm,
shooting at each other with Oakleys, and think that it's entertaining to be raising welts on the
mm,
bodies of each other. It's a rite of passage for many parts of the organizations.
mm,
And I see no groin protection, no throat protection,
mm.
no face protection. It's not
Yeah.
okay. And so,
Yeah,
so
I definitely.
safety, there's
Mhm.
physical safety and there's emotional safety. And we need to be able to
Right.
address both of those things.
Right. I wholeheartedly agree. The old adage, complacency kills. But it's a strange conundrum that, it's 100% preventable, but it's
No,
100%
I'm
going to
seeing
happen.
I'm sorry, I was seeing a
Oh,
pause in
oh,
the what's it say 99% uploading or something. So
oh, no
yeah,
problem.
I heard you say the old adage.
Yeah. So it's the old adage, complacency kills. You're expecting the same result because it's happened 1,000 times, similar to the
I'm
munitions.
sorry, Jared. We seem to have an unstable connection again.
So the old adage, complacency kills, and it's just this strange conundrum of it's
Yes.
100% preventable, but it's 100% going to happen. So it doesn't have to happen to us because we can prevent it by taking these safety measures and have a zero tolerance policy as well. Especially with these Bluetooth weapon systems, no live weapon systems, no live ammo. Even market. I've seen agencies mark their simulated weapon systems with colored tape, just to associate them with the simulation system itself. So there's no accidental mix up. And I think,
Mm.
right, yeah. And if you're okay with it, Ken, we can pause here. I know we have a hard stop at 5. I do want to go into the roles and responsibilities of an instructor, especially that train the trainer program, um, and the responsibility of even the solution providers of these simulators, their
Mm.
responsibilities in developing robust train the trainer programs to ensure that the instructors have the capabilities and the tools and the knowledge on full integration of their systems. So Ken, if you're okay with it, we can do a hard stop here and maybe do a part 2 for and dive into the instructor role and their responsibilities from the trainer programs to developing robust programs and instructor involvement, because I do want to go into the pre-mission briefings and the importance of that,
Mm.
monitoring and control, and then of course the conducting the after action, whether it's self-assessment or instructor guided.
Yeah, well, wise to stop here because we're going down a whole another spiraled area
Right.
that deserves a robust discussion. And so
Right.
I'm really enjoying where this is going right now, and I'm looking
Perfect.
very much forward to part two.
Yeah, you have a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience. And I do want to come back for a part two. So I do want to open it up to any, saved rounds that you might have on the topics that we've discussed. Otherwise, you can go ahead and again plug the RTBA Association website. Where can you find Training at the Speed of Life? I just assume everybody owns the book, but if those that don't, where can they find it?
It's the RBTA, like the Reality Based Training Association, rbta.net. I apologize for not being a good website creator. I need a geek in my life. And if there's anyone out there that wants to volunteer their time and take a better, deeper dive onto that, I would appreciate any assistance in that regard. In the meantime, there's some basic information on the site. You'll be able to find upcoming classes that are still open, mostly organizationally. I do not have any reluctance to training civilians. But most of my classes are bought out by organizations, police and military organizations, and they have a reluctance in mixing the two streams. And so if there's your listenership or viewership that are interested in hosting some training, I'm completely open to that. In fact, I'm encouraging it. There should be more training on the civilian side than there is on the military side, although it's really important that the military stuff gets done. Mm-hmm. So the RBTA website, rbta.net, Training at the Speed of Life, available on Amazon, but you can get it directly on our website at the RBTA website. Any questions that your viewers have, by all means, if this segment airs before we are able to get to part two, then by all means, how about we have a Q&A for the stuff that's already been messaged, because I'm sure there's going to be some questions and perhaps controversy around some of those things. And I welcome controversy. I believe in looking at the perspectives from any side of the conversation. And if you can convince me that I'm wrong on a point, I change the point. If I can convince you that you're wrong on the point, I'll illuminate the area that you're unsure of. But there's the middle part as well, where we just might not agree on certain things. If an organization believes that it's perfectly safe to train without face protection, and I can't convince you otherwise, you're not going to move me off my position, and I won't move you off your position. So those are arguments probably not worth having. And so other than that, I welcome dialogue on all of this stuff, and I look forward to our next time together, Jared.
Yeah, Ken, I think there is value in posting this prior to our next engagement, with the value of the Q&A session. And just to reiterate, we'll discuss the roles of the instructor, go into the trainer-to-trainer programs, developing robust programs, and heavy instructor involvement. And I do also want to touch on the future of reality-based training in areas such as, augmented reality and these XR platforms as well. So Ken, thanks again for meeting with me, and hope you stay safe and busy.
And to you as well. Thanks, Jared. Bye,
Thank
folks.
you. Bye now.